The Rock and Roll Unraveled Show. I'm Derek Shelmadine. Welcome to another Rock and Roll Unraveled Show. One of the greatest bands in rock and roll history, the Rolling Stones. We're going to take a look at where it all started and their golden age. The Rolling Stones' Brian Jones years. Now, Brian Jones was born on the 28th of February 1942 in Cheltenham in Gloucestershire. I mean, he was Lewis Brian Hopkin Jones, and he was the founder of the Rolling Stones. Make no mistake about that. It was Brian's band. Now, he was a multi-instrumentalist, and in the late 50s he was playing in local Cheltenham jazz bands, trad jazz bands, and he played saxophone or guitar. He also started playing in R&B bands, and by 1961 he joined the Ramrods and played saxophone. But his focus was very much moving to guitar. And it was while he was in Cheltenham that he met Alexis Korner and regularly travelled up to London and stayed with Korner while he was in London. Now, around this time, he's reputed to have sat in with Eric Clapton in his first band, the Roosters. Though I haven't seen an awful lot of confirmation of that. But he absolutely, very definitely played, but was never actually a member of Paul Pond's Thunder Odin and the Big Secret. Now, Paul Pond changed his name to Paul Jones and found fame with Manfred Mann. And while he was with Thunder Odin, they recorded a tape and actually gave it to Alexis Korner to try and get some interest out of him. Paul Jones repeatedly invited Brian to join Thunder Odin and the Big Secret, but Brian told him that if he was going to be in a band, it would be his own band. And that's exactly what he went and did. It was in early 1962 that Brian formed his first lineup, and that included Brian Knight on vocals and harmonica, Geoff Bradford on guitar, and Ian Stewart, that's a name that's going to crop up a lot, on piano. Now, Brian made his first guest appearance with Blues Incorporated in the March of 1962, and when he played with Alexis Korner's band, he called himself Elmo Lewis. Elmo after his blues guitar hero, Elmore James, and Lewis, of course, from his own first name. He was Lewis Brian Hopkin Jones. And in mid-62, Brian Knight decided it was time to move on and form his own group, so he left Brian Jones and formed Blues by Six, and Geoff Bradford decided to go with him. So we're now in May 1962, and this is when Brian advertised in Jazz News to find some people to join his band. Well, welcome to the story, Mick Jagger and Keith Richard, both born in Dartford in Kent. Mick on the 26th of July 1943, and Keith about 6 months later on the 18th of December. Now, Keith's interesting because he was actually born Keith Richards with an S at the end, but in the 1960s, the early 60s, he decided to drop the S from his name and reverted to the original spelling in the late 70s. Now, they met, Mick and Keith, when they went to the same primary school, but they lost touch because they went to different secondary schools, and they bumped into each other again on the 17th of October 1961 on Dartford railway station. There's even a plaque to commemorate this. And their sort of mutual love of the blues inspired them to form their first band, Little Boy Blue and the Blue Boys. Now, the band name probably came from Sonny Boy Williamson too, who went by the name of Little Boy Blue in the early days. Now, they had a chum, Dick Taylor, at the time, and he joined them in the band, and he's the same Dick Taylor that went on to form Pretty Things. And in late 61, Little Boy Blue and the Blue Boys actually made a recording, and the lineup for that was Mick, Keith and Dick Taylor with Alan Etherington and Bob Beckwith. But it was the 7th of April 1962 when Mick and Keith met Brian and Charlie Watts when they were both playing in Alexis Korner's Blues Incorporated at a gig at London's Ealing Club. Now, the vocalist at that particular gig was Paul Pond, the guy that became Paul Jones and Manfred Mann hero. Now, not only did Mick and Keith meet Brian and Charlie Watts that night, they both went on to perform with Blues Incorporated, Mick as a very regular vocalist. There's a very interesting photo of Blues Incorporated taken at the Marquee around May 1962. and it lists the lineup, and you can see Dave Stevens on piano. Now, before he was with Blues Incorporated, he was with Chris Barber, Beryl Bryden's backroom skiffle group. He emigrated to Australia in 1965. Dick Hexel-Smith on sax. Now, he was with John Mayall, Graham Bond and Colosseum. Now, they're at the heavier end of the jazz rock fusion spectrum. Alexis Korner himself on guitar, Jack Bruce on upright bass. He went on to form Cream. Mick Jagger on vocals and Cyril Davis on harmonica. Wow, what a lineup. Well, that brings us back to May 1962 and Brian with that advert in Jazz News to form his second lineup. And that included Ian Stewart, who was the original pianist from the first lineup, Mick Keith and Dick Taylor. Now, Dick Taylor moved from guitar to bass when he joined Brian's group, and he was never happy about that. And on the drum stool was Tony Chapman from a band called the Cliftons, and that's the same band that Bill Wyman was to come from in a few moments' time. And on the 12th of July 1962, they played their first gig as the Rolling Stones at the Marquee Club in London. Now, the gig came about because Alexis Korner's Blues Incorporated had been offered a chance to perform on the BBC Radio's prestigious Jazz Club the same night as their regular Thursday night residency at the Marquee Club. So they got agreement that the Rolling Stones would fill in for them. And the lineup that night included Mick, Keith and Brian, with pianist Ian Stewart and Dick Taylor on bass. And there's an urban myth that puts future Kinks drummer Mick Avery on the drumming stool, and that's actually supported by the Stones' own website account of the gig. But other sources suggest it was far more likely that it was Tony Chapman who played drums that night, because in an interview with the website Cast Off Kinks, Avery confirmed that, and I quote, "I didn't actually play a gig with the Stones, I just rehearsed to do a gig with them, but it never happened." So, who knows who was on the stool that night? And the band took their name from Muddy Waters' song Rolling Stone. That was released in 1950, and it was the second ever single on the newly formed Chess Records. And this is the song that inspired the Rolling Stones to call themselves that, and it's Muddy Waters with Rolling Stone. The Rolling Stones entered the recording studios for the first time on the 27th of October 1962 when they went into Curly Clayton Studios in London's Highgate. Now, it wasn't a classic five yet. The lineup was Mick, Brian and Keith, with pianist Ian Stewart and drummer Tony Chapman. Sources split actually as to whether or not bassist Dick Taylor played on this session, because he left the group around this sort of time. I mean, you could really see the kind of music they were playing with the recordings they made that day. Muddy Waters, Soon Forgotten, Jimmy Reed's Close Together, and Bo Diddley's You Can't Judge a Book by the Cover. Now, the recording was made as a demo tape that they could hawk around London's record companies in search of a deal, but sadly there were no takers. Well, it's time for Bill Wyman to enter the scene. Now, Bill was born on the 24th of October 1936. He was actually called William Perks. He was born in Sydenham in South London, and he came to the Stones via a different route. All the other guys played to a greater or lesser extent with Alexis Korner's Blues Incorporated. Around 1957, Bill Wyman had formed a skiffle group with Liverpool legend Brian Casser while they were both on national service. And it was there that he adopted the stage name Lee Wyman, which became modified to Bill Wyman, and it was borrowed from a friend from his national service days. Now, Bill Wyman played with the Cliftons, which is the same band that drummer Tony Chapman had come from. And he auditioned for the Stones on the 7th of December 1962 at the Weatherby Arms pub in Chelsea. Now, the Stones were particularly impressed with Bill Wyman's equipment. He had a pair of Vox AC30 amps and echo unit. And from his book, in his words, they were impressed with my enormous wardrobe-sized cabinet with the 18-inch speaker. Well, the last outing for Tony Chapman came on the 11th of January 1963 at the Ricky Tick Club in Windsor. Other drummers filled in around this time, including people like Carlo Little from Screaming Lord Sutch's band. And in fact, welcome Charlie Watts to the story. He was born on the 2nd of June 1941 in London, and he started his career, believe it or not, with Alexis Corner's band, Blues Incorporated. That's around February 1962. Now, going back to Brian's band, I mentioned earlier that Brian Knight was in Brian Jones's first lineup, and when Brian Knight decided to split with Brian Jones to form his own band, Blues by Six, Charlie Watts was with Blues Incorporated, and he decided to leave Blues Incorporated to join him in Blues by Six. And Charlie Watts was replaced in Blues Incorporated by future Cream drummer Ginger Baker. Well, Charlie Watts joined the Stones around the January of 1963, and it was the 24th of February when the band played their first gig at the Crawdaddy Club, very famous club in Richmond, West London, and they actually became the house band there. They replaced the Dave Hunt R&B band, and interestingly enough, in late 62, just before he joined the Stones, Charlie Watts occasionally played with Dave Hunt's R&B band. Now, the owner of the club, Giorgio Gomelski, became the Stones' first manager, and on the 11th of March 63, the Stones were back in the recording studios, this time at IBC. This is another attempt to attract a record deal, but this time it was Glyn Johns at the controls, and they recorded a couple of Bo Diddley songs, Diddley Daddy and Roadrunner, Jimmy Reed's Baby What's Wrong and Bright Lights Big City, and Willie Dixon's I Want to Be Loved. But things really started to change for the Stones on the 28th of April 63 when they met Andrew Loog Oldham. Oldham and his partner Eric Easton had travelled to Richmond's Crawdaddy Club to get a glimpse of this band everybody's talking about, the Rolling Stones. And when Oldham saw the Stones at the Crawdaddy, the band was managed by club owner Giorgio Gomelski. But after this performance, Oldham managed to persuade them to come along and sign up with him. Oldham really made 4 crucial changes that would mould the future of the Rolling Stones. I mean, having seen the Beatles' success with their own material, he wanted Jagger and Richard to write their own songs. He moved the focus of the group from founder Brian Jones to singer Mick Jagger. And he also wanted a bad boy image for the Stones, again to contrast with Epstein's clean-cut image for the Beatles. But sadly for pianist Ian Stewart, the first Stone to join Brian Jones's group in early 62, Andrew Loog Oldham decided that he had the wrong image for the band, so he was relegated to road manager, but did play piano at recording sessions. When the Stones left Giorgio Gomelski for Andrew Loog Oldham, he took his new house band from another one of the groups he managed, and that was none other than the Yardbirds. In June 63 they released their first UK single, Come On, backed with I Want to Be Loved, and the A-side was a cover of Chuck Berry's original, and the B-side was a Willie Dixon song. It was released as a single by Muddy Waters in 1955. Both sides were produced by manager Andrew Loog Oldham, and we're now with the classic lineup of Brian, Mick, Keith, Bill and Charlie. This gave them their first UK hit, a number 21. It wasn't a hit in America. That didn't come until August 1964 with Tell Me, but this is Chuck Berry and the original version of Come On. You're listening to Derek Shelmerdine with the Rock and Roll Unravelled show. We're taking a look at the Rolling Stones, the Brian Jones years. But before continuing with the story, there's an opportunity to win a signed copy of my book, Rock and Roll Unravelled. Every month, in conjunction with the Rock and Roll Unravelled show, there's a simple question to enter the draw to win a signed copy. For the current question, just check out the website, rockandrollunravelled.com. That's unravelled with 2 L's. Follow the link to the quiz at the top of the page. Send me the answer, and lucky winner will get a copy of Rock and Roll Unravelled. Tells a story of rock and roll from its roots to mid-1970s punk. Record Collector liked it and described it as comprehensive and invaluable. Good luck with the competition. Meanwhile, back at the plot. Well, on the 9th of July 1963, the Stones were back in the recording studio to record Fortune Teller, an Alan Toussaint song. Now, in the UK, it was coupled with Poison Ivy and released as the second single, but very quickly withdrawn. Now very collectible, worth upwards of £1,500. Check the attic. Their official second single in the UK was I Want to Be Your Man, coupled with Stoned, and that's A-side was a Lennon McCartney song. Only got to number 12, but given their second UK hit, the same coupling was released in February of 1964 as the Stones' US debut single, but once again that was withdrawn and is very collectible. A copy sold in 2016 for $9,000. In the November, the Stones recorded My Only Girl. Now that became That Girl Belongs to Yesterday and was Jagger and Richards' first songwriting hit record, and that came about when a couple of days after the recording session, the Stones and Gene Pitney both appeared on the pop music TV show Thank Your Lucky Stars. Pitney had heard the song and agreed to record it. Now he liked the lyrics but changed the melody, and that's when the song was renamed to That Girl Belongs to Yesterday, and as I said, it gave Jagger and Richard their first songwriting hit record. It was a number 7 in the UK, and it was Gene Pitney's fourth UK hit. Interestingly enough, the Stones never released their version of the song, and on the 1st of January 1964 it was the first ever Top of the Pops TV show, and they opened with the Stones' I Want to Be Your Man. The show was presented by Jimmy Savile and featured performances from Dusty Springfield, the Dave Clark Five, the Hollies and the Swingin' Blue Jeans. In February they released Not Fade Away, coupled with Little by Little. That was their third official single, and Not Fade Away was written by Buddy Holly and was the B-side of Oh Boy, and that was a 1958 hit on both sides of the pond. Now the B-side, Little by Little, had a writing credit of Felge and Phil Spector, and when the writing credit went to the whole band, the Stones tended to use the pseudonym Felge, sometimes Nanka Felge. Now in the April of 64 they released their first album, gave them a chart-topping album before they had a chart-topping single, interestingly enough, and it was on the album charts for 51 weeks. And in the June of 64 they took themselves off to America for their first US tour. British invasion was well in full swing by then. They opened on the West Coast in San Bernardino and finished on the 20th of June in New York's Carnegie Hall. And probably as a result of touring, they had their first American hit record in the August. It got to number 24, and that was Tell Me You're Coming Back. And that was a Jagger and Richard composition, not released as a single in the UK, but it was on their first UK album. And in July they had their first UK number 1, and that came with their fourth single, It's All Over Now, and that was written by Bobby and Shirley Womack and originally released by the Valentinos in 1964. But I love the Christmas of 1964. The Stones took out an ad in the New Musical Express to wish barbers a Merry Christmas. And what the ad said, very tongue-in-cheek, and I quote, "Happy Christmas to the starving hairdressers and their families." A reference to the fact that the fashion for long hair amongst young men was now growing very rapidly. The Beatles very much started this trend, and they'd been inspired by the X's, an intellectual bunch of beatniks basically, during their early trips to Hamburg, and they adopted the style when, well, John and Paul adopted the style when they went to Paris in the October of 1961. And in the March of 65, the first Jagger and Richard penned A-side entered the UK charts, and that was the last time. That was their third UK number 1, actually their sixth hit single. Well, more than 30 years later, Alan Klein sued the Verve for misusing a sampling agreement on their song Bittersweet Symphony. Now Klein, whose company ABCO owned the rights to The Last Time, agreed the Verve could sample the song, And that was the version recorded in 1965 by the Andrew Oldham Orchestra. Now, after its release, Klein sued for misuse of the agreement, and they settled after Bittersweet Symphony had a writing credit for Jagger and Richard. It wasn't until 2019 that the credit was given back to the Verve's Richard Ashcroft. And in the April of 65, they left for their third American tour, and this was the time of Satisfaction. They released that at around the same time, and it gave them their first American #1. Now, when it was released in August in the UK, it had a different B-side. It was coupled with Spider and the Fly. And in America, it had been released with the wonderfully titled The Under Assistant West Coast Promotion Men. And when it was first released in the UK, it was pressed up wrongly using the American B-side rather than Spider and the Fly. But interestingly enough, none of it went to waste. These pressings were used for export. So again, check the attic, see which B-side you've got on Satisfaction. Now, I saw the Satisfaction tour when it came to the UK, and on the 1st of October, I was in Chester at the ABC Theatre, and it was awesome. This was the days when tours used to consist of 7 or 8 acts doing 15 or 20 minutes, and often using British cinemas with the screen taken down for the venues. And when the Stones came on, every girl in the audience stood up and screamed throughout the entire Stones performance. It was an awesome evening. Now, in September 65, they released their third UK album, Out of Our Heads. Interestingly enough, it only got to #2. Their first 2 albums had reached #1, and their next album reached #1. But this is actually my favourite of the Stones' early albums. And from Out of Our Heads, we're going to have a little listen to Good Times. It started life as a Sam Cooke release. He wrote it and had an American hit in 1964. Not a UK hit, because his last UK hit had come with Frankie and Johnny in 1963. But this is the Rolling Stones and their wonderful version of Good Times. You're listening to Derek Shelmadine and the Rock and Roll Unraveled Show, with a look at the Rolling Stones, the Brian Jones years. Now, lots of the artists and bands who were mentioned in the show are actually out on tour. And to see the latest tour information, just check out my website, rockandrollunraveled.com. That's unraveled with 2 L's. And at the top you'll see 1960s, 70s artists touring now. And take it from me, if they're still alive, you'll find these guys out on the road. Well, back to the story. Well, the Stones' contractual situation was about to take on a life of its own. Now, back in May 1963, Andrew Oldham and Eric Easton signed the Stones up, and they negotiated the original recording deal with Decca. But they didn't sign the Stones directly to Decca. It was Oldham and Easton's company, Impact Sound, that owned the master tapes and the recordings. And in summer of 1965, Andrew Oldham hired Alan Klein as his business manager, and he made this appointment without actually telling the Stones anything about it. And Klein renegotiated a new contract with Decca, and this time he just cut Eric Easton out completely. Well, Easton sued, but that's another story. And in the April of 66, they released their 4th album, Aftermath, and that was the first to contain all Jagger and Richard compositions, and it gave them their 3rd UK #1. Now, initially the album was going to be called Could You Walk on Water? But Decca sort of balked at the idea of such a title, and it was released as Aftermath. And on the 28th of July, Brian Jones played his last gig on American soil, and that was in Hawaii at the Honolulu International Centre. And when they came back the September-October, that was their last, well, that was Brian's last UK tour. The Stones didn't tour the UK again until 1971. But it was January 1967 when they released Let's Spend the Night Together. Now the B-side was Ruby Tuesday, and that was one of the Stones' earliest ventures into psychedelia, and in fact a cover of it from Melanie gave her a British hit in 1970. Now 2 days after they released it, they appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show in America, and they performed Ruby Tuesday and Let's Spend the Night Together, but the producers were unhappy about the lyrics and they changed the lyrics so that Jagger sang about spending some time together rather than the night together. Sensibility of TV producers in those days. And a week later they appeared on the UK's prestigious Sunday Night at the London Palladium, and they refused to stand on the revolving stage that was used in the show's finale, a traditional goodbye wave from the assembled performers. Now, the reason for the Stones' reluctance to join the others on the revolving stage was probably an attempt to regain some street credibility after succumbing to the censorship on the recent Ed Sullivan Show. Now, in the February of 1967, Mick and Keith were subject to a drugs bust, and Andrew Oldham decided that this was not a good place for him to be, so he fled to America to make sure he didn't get embroiled in it, and he left Alan Klein to sort the whole thing out. And by late 1967, Andrew Loog Oldham had actually sold his share to Alan Klein, and he just parted company with the Stones completely. But remember, it was Impact Sound, Andrew Oldham's company, that owned the Stones back catalogue. So now the Stones back catalogue was owned by Alan Klein, and he continued that until his contract expired in the August of 1970. So ABCO, Alan Klein's company, owns the Stones back catalogue up until the beginning of the 1970s. It wasn't then until the Stones regained ownership of their own recordings. But it was the 31st of July 67 when Mick and Keith won their appeal against the drugs conviction. They'd been found guilty, actually received prison sentences, but an immediate appeal meant that they were bailed, but not before they experienced the joys of being held at Her Majesty's pleasure. But they did receive support from a very unexpected quarter when the Times newspaper published an editorial by William Rees-Mogg entitled "Who Breaks a Butterfly on a Wheel?" They also had some support from The Who. The Who recorded and released a cover version of the Stones' Last Time. And the 8th of June saw Brian back in the recording studios, but this time it was with the Beatles, and he was playing sax on the Beatles' You Know My Name, Look Up the Number, and that was actually released as the B-side of Let It Be. And in the August of 67 they released We Love You, coupled with Dandelion, and it was the last single to be produced by Andrew Oldham. It gave them a number 8. It was their 13th UK hit, and it reflected, as you'd imagine, on their recent prison experiences. And again, showing solidarity, this time it's John Lennon and Paul McCartney. They provided some backing vocals on We Love You. Now, We Love You wasn't a hit in America. Interestingly enough, it was the other side, Dandelion, that gave them their 15th US hit when it took them to the number 14 point in Billboard. And this is the Rolling Stones with their take on prison life. We Love You. The beginning of the end for Brian came in the October of 67 when he pleaded guilty to drugs charges based on a police raid earlier in the year. And despite his 9-month prison sentence being commuted on appeal to probation and a fine, it gave Brian a real problem in getting a visa to work in America, and contributed to his departure from the Stones in 69. But going back to 67, that's when they released Their Satanic Majesty's Request, and it was the first Stones album to attract a mixed reception from the fans and critics alike. Although it did give them a number 3, it was their 7th UK hit album. In the May of '68, Brian released his last single with the band. That was Jumpin' Jack Flash, and it was also the first single not to be produced by Andrew Loog Oldham. It was produced by Jimmy Miller. It did give them a number one. It was their 14th UK hit single, and they only ever had actually one more number one after that. That was the next single, Honky Tonk Women, and that was the first single with Mick Taylor. Now in November, Brian Jones bought Cotchford Farm in Sussex. That had previously been owned by author A. Milne and was used for the setting of his Winnie the Pooh stories. And one of the best Stones albums ever came out in the December of '68, Beggar's Banquet. Some covers have a plain white sleeve and others have an image of a toilet wall. And that photo itself comes from an auto repair shop in Hollywood. And that was the last album released in Brian Jones's lifetime. But an interesting one was the 11th of December 1968. They recorded a TV special, Rock and Roll Circus. It was an extravaganza filmed in front of an invited audience. Glyn Johns was the engineer, and it was Brian Jones' final performance with the Stones. The acts included John Lennon. He introduced himself as Winston Legthigh with his Dirty Mac band, and that featured guitarist Eric Clapton, Keith Richard on bass, drummer Mitch Mitchell from the Jimi Hendrix Experience, and that was John Lennon's first performance outside the Fab Four, because he was, of course, still with the Beatles for some time to come yet. Now, Jethro Tull were also on the bill, and they were there with guitarist Tony Iommi. He'd recently joined them from Earth. They performed Song for Jeffrey, and Iommi went back to Earth shortly afterwards, and of course they became Black Sabbath. And The Who famously performed A Quick One, While He's Away. An urban myth has it that Mick Jagger didn't sanction the release of this TV special at the time because he thought they'd been totally and utterly upstaged by the Who. And it was 1996 before a DVD release of the extravaganza appeared. And it was the 8th of June when the end came for Brian, 1969, when he was sacked from the Rolling Stones, from the band he'd originally formed. But his relationship had been deteriorating for quite a while, really, as the music was moving progressively away from the blues that he loved. He was replaced by ex-John Mayall guitarist Mick Taylor, and the new lineup played their first gig a month later at the Free Hyde Park concert on the 5th of July. Now, Brian did have some discussions with Alexis Corner about joining his band New Church, but apparently Alexis told Brian he'd be better off forming his own group. But before that could happen, sadly on the 3rd of July 1969, Brian Jones died and joined the macabre 27 Club, that group of musicians who died at the age of 27. Around midnight he was found dead in his swimming pool of his home at Cotchford Farm. Now, the events surrounding his death have always been shrouded in controversy. In fact, the Daily Mail had an article on the 30th of August 2009 said the police were reviewing Jones's death as new evidence had come to light, but nothing heard since. Now, the death certificate gave the cause of death as, quotes, drowning, severe liver dysfunction due to fatty degeneration and the ingestion of alcohol and drugs, and then underlined swimming whilst under the influence of alcohol and drugs, and in uppercase, misadventure. Well, business as usual for the Stones. The following day they released Honky Tonk Women. That was the first single to feature Mick Taylor. It gave them a number one, and as I mentioned earlier, it was their last ever UK number one, well, to date anyway. Well, that's it. I've been Derek Shelmadine. You've been listening to the Rock and Roll Unravelled show and the story of the Rolling Stones, the Brian Jones years. I hope you've enjoyed the show as much as I have in putting the whole thing together. If you're into social media, you can find me on Twitter at RNR Unravelled, Facebook at Rock and Roll Unravelled, and remember you can win a copy of my book, Rock and Roll Unravelled. Simply check out the website rockandrollunraveled.com, and all these unravels are with 2 L's, and click on the link to the competition. Good luck with the competition. Join me again next time for another look at a little piece of rock and roll unravelled. And to play us out, this is Brian going back to his roots, and it's from that last Stones album, Beggar's Banquet. It's No Expectations. Brian plays blues slide guitar, and this was the last major contribution Brian made to the band. Just listen to the lyrics, they're just so apt. And this is the Rolling Stones and No Expectations.